Speaker.
I call the honourable member Kennedy Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend David Cunliffe for his impassioned speech, something that is conspicuously lacking from the government. The committee has held its foreshortened hearings and deliberation. It has returned its report by majority only to this House. The Green Party still opposes the ETS amendment bill and explains why in our minority report. Part of the reason has to do with the global reality out there that David Cunliffe has just spoken about. The gathering reality of climate change, already better termed climate disruption, possibly turning to climate chaos sooner rather than later. But I'll address that later in another final reading. Today we focus on the intense unreality that is the New Zealand emissions trading scheme and the sad irony, the sad history that has led up to the mess that we are now in. My purpose is not to damn the past for its own sake, but to seek what we can learn from the experience before it is too late. In understanding this amendment bill and why the Green Party opposes it so strongly, it is necessary to recall what has gone before. The litany of bold pronouncements, faint-hearted gestures, deliberate self-deception and downright chicanery. It is breathtaking in its political cowardice, and it brings no credit to New Zealand as a nation. It reveals governmental failure on a monumental scale. We find over the past 2 decades 8 about-faces in the history of New Zealand's renunciation of its fair share of climate change obligation. In 1990, the government declared an interim goal of a 20% drop in gross emissions below 1990 by 2005. It would explore a goal of 35% by 2005. A brave new world long since abandoned. Feint number 1. In 1992, just after signing the Framework Convention, the government drops the 20% target, promising only to reduce emissions to 1990 levels, with no specified period. Number 2. In 1994, the government moderates its ambition again, to equalling 1990 levels by 2000. This time not gross emissions, but the new concept of net, using forestry sinks to help meet our emission obligations. Number 3, in 1997, New Zealand signs Kyoto with the legal obligation to cut our total emissions to 1990 levels, not by 2000, but in the period 2012, a whole decade later. Fast forward 5 years to number 4. In 2002, the government implements the Kyoto Protocol on the understanding it will meet its obligation on a net basis, not gross. This accords us freedom to increase gross emissions without constraint. Number 5 coming up. The government, having declared in 2002 a goal of peak gross emissions by 2012, revises that 3 years later by predicting continued growth in emissions after 2012. The goal is now simply reducing the rate of growth by that year. Here comes number 6. In its 2008 legislation, the government takes the goal of reducing the rate of growth by an unspecified amount over an unspecified period. The target year of 2012 drops from sight. Enter the key government, and number 7. In 2009, the government accepts the 450 part per million threshold of carbon atmospheric concentration with the associated 2-degree limit, but announces a midpoint target of 2020 of 15%, half of that required to meet the threshold. Number 8 coincides. The 15% will not be a mitigation target in which we actually reduce our gross or even our net emissions, but rather a responsibility target that can be met also by the unlimited purchasing of international credits. And it is qualified by a number of essentially unattainable conditions. Bravo! It is an exquisite irony that the European Union is committed to an unconditional 20% target by 2020, virtually what New Zealand declared as a goal for 2005 back in 1990. The history of the 22 years has shown New Zealand to become a laggard now in climate change. We have downgraded our promises to make things easier in the short term, forgoing the opportunity of switching to a smart, green, low-carbon economy that would benefit us all in the medium term and ensuring dangerous, perhaps catastrophic climate change in the long term. What we have constructed over 20 years is a madhouse of self-deception, of which this amendment bill is the latest shiny model. The Select Committee received 803 submissions and heard from 73. Many reflected corporate self-interest. That is valid enough as far as it goes, even if it is occasionally myopic on its own terms. But it is never the national interest, and it surely is not the global interest. Others reflected the broader interests, expressing alarm from the most recent scientific findings of polar ice melt. That has in no way derailed the key grocer regime in fudging the matters further. The result is an ETS that will celebrate the end of the first Kyoto commitment period, 20 years after the Framework Convention, by encouraging emissions. The Amendment Act will not respond to the challenge of climate change. It will busy itself with transfers of monetary coupons circulating with near total futility inside New Zealand as the planet's climate begins to wreak its havoc upon us. What titanic stupidity. The government has come to regard the Kyoto commitment period as a transition period, a 5-year transition period that is a prelude to an 8-year transition period to a global agreement that begins too late. With its weakened ETS, New Zealand is becoming a safe haven for dirty emissions. Carbon leakage may transform into carbon importation. The ETS, originally designed to be a stimulant to behavioural change, has become a prophylactic against that change. Our gross emissions continue to rise, and we are saved in Kyoto accounting terms by the forestry sector, which incidentally has been given a bad deal. The government fails the child's test of logic that today's forest sinks are tomorrow's emissions. Not too bright on the IQ scale for intergenerational justice. This government plays up the free market as its ideological underpin, then interferes with the market at its political discretion. The price cap, a 50% surrender obligation, sectoral favouritism, free allocations, non-convertibility of most local units. Not too bright on the IQ scale for socio-economic harmony. The New Zealand scheme has become a magician's trick, self-deception by numbers. Presiding officer is Minister Grosser, chief wizard of neoliberal orthodoxy in trade, an art translated directly into climate change, as if the climate is a tradable commodity. His devolved Prime Minister looks on, not entirely familiar with the drama or cognizant of the content, knowing enough not to want to know more, careful not to read the documents or recall what might have been said. Like the blighted captain of the Rena, Mr. Key sails on, courting disaster, but hopeful that his tenure will run its course before nature exacts its revenge. In the greatest brain fade of a career, he said in 2005, quote, he was suspicious of global warming. That was 13 years after all the governments of the world had agreed to a binding legal obligation to avoid it. 18 months later, he said, I firmly believe in climate change, I always have. As if science is a matter of belief. Our ETS has become so degraded relative to the original theory of cap and trade that some think it is beyond rescue as a framework for a real climate change policy. What we need is a policy regime that effectively prices carbon and thereby reduces emissions. Something above the UN offset price, which fell 30% 2 days ago, with CERs and ERUs below €1. That's a carbon price here of $1.30 or 65 cents after the 2-for-1 deal. Brilliant. It may be time now to revisit the whole edifice of New Zealand's climate change policy. Whatever the future holds, it is critically important we strengthen, not weaken, the New Zealand policy, for we are now lagging behind other countries. The Green Party will oppose this bill all the way through, and we shall, before long, advance new ways of restoring New Zealand's climate change reputation through a strengthened national mitigation policy.
I call the Honourable Member Paul Goldsmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's very interesting